Ancient Greece, the civilization that invented the future. If you look around the world today, at the architecture of government buildings in Washington, London, or Paris, at the vocabulary of science and medicine, at the structure of a dramatic play or a Hollywood screenplay, and even at the way we formulate logical arguments in a courtroom, you are looking at the ghosts of a civilization that flourished more than 2,000 years ago on a rocky peninsula in the Mediterranean. We often speak of the ancient Greeks as the founders of Western civilization, a phrase that has been repeated so often it has lost some of its impact, becoming a dusty cliché in history textbooks. But the reality of what happened in ancient Greece is far stranger, more vibrant, and more unlikely than the standard summaries suggest. It is the story of a collection of quarreling city-states, united by language and religion, but divided by geography and politics, who somehow managed to spark a cognitive revolution that completely reshaped the human experience. This is not just a story of statues and columns, but a story of a fundamental shift in how human beings understood their place in the cosmos. To understand the Greeks is to understand the moment when humanity stopped looking exclusively at the ground or the sky for supernatural explanations and started looking at each other and the natural world with a critical, analytical eye. The story begins not with the white marble temples we associate with the Golden Age, but much earlier, in the mists of the Bronze Age. Geography is destiny, and in the case of Greece, the geography was particularly harsh. The land is mountainous, fragmented, and notoriously difficult to farm. Unlike the great river valley civilizations of Egypt or Mesopotamia, where the Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates provided vast, contiguous swaths of fertile land that encouraged centralized, top-down empires, Greece was broken into isolated pockets, a valley here, a plain there, separated by jagged peaks and connected chiefly by the sea. This geography is the first key to understanding the Greek mind. Because the land could not support a massive, monolithic empire, it encouraged the growth of independent, self-reliant communities. The sea was their highway, turning the Greeks into sailors, traders, and adventurers from the very beginning. It forced them to look outward, to interact with other cultures, to absorb ideas from Egypt and the Near East, and then to twist those ideas into something uniquely their own. Before the classical Greeks we know, there were the Minoans on the island of Crete and the Mycenaeans on the mainland. The Minoans, flourishing from roughly 2700 to 1450 BC, were a civilization of palace builders centered on Knossos. Archaeologists have uncovered a society that seems almost strikingly modern in its aesthetics, with vibrant frescoes depicting bull leaping and marine life, intricate plumbing systems, and a lack of heavy defensive walls, suggesting a period of relative peace or naval dominance. They were a trading power, connected to the wider Mediterranean network. But they were eclipsed by the Mycenaeans, a Greek-speaking people from the mainland who were far more martial. The Mycenaeans built great citadels with massive cyclopean walls, coined from the later belief that only giants could have moved such stones. This was the era of the Trojan War, if such a war actually happened. While the details of Homer's Iliad are mythological, they rest on a bed of historical memory. The Mycenaeans were a warrior aristocracy, utilizing chariots and bronze weapons to dominate the Aegean. They were bureaucrats as well as fighters, keeping detailed records in a script known as Linear B, which was used primarily for inventory, counting sheep, jars of oil, and chariot wheels. But then, around 1200 BC, the lights went out. The Bronze Age collapse is one of history's great mysteries, a catastrophic systems failure that swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Palaces were burned, trade routes were severed, and civilizations that had stood for centuries vanished or were severely diminished. The Hittites fell, Egypt was besieged, and the Mycenaean world disintegrated. Greece plunged into what historians used to call the Dark Ages. Writing was lost. The population plummeted. The great stone palaces were abandoned to the weeds. For several centuries, life became smaller, poorer, and simpler. Yet, it was in this darkness that the iron skeleton of the future Greek civilization was forged. Iron replaced bronze as the metal of choice, not because it was better initially, but because the trade routes for tin, needed to make bronze, had collapsed. Iron was harder to work with, requiring higher temperatures, but the ore was available locally. This democratization of metal meant that weapons and tools became cheaper and more accessible, gradually eroding the exclusive power of the chariot-riding aristocracy. During this long incubation period, the oral traditions that would become the Iliad and the Odyssey were refined and passed down by bards. These poems were not just entertainment, they were the encyclopedias of the Greek mind. They taught the concept of arete, or excellence. In the Homeric world, a man's worth was determined by his ability to perform, to fight, to speak, and to win glory that would outlast his death. This obsession with individual glory and competition, the agon, would become a defining feature of Greek culture. Whether in athletics, drama, pottery, or war, the Greeks were obsessed with being the best, without outdoing their rivals. This competitive spirit prevented them from ever truly uniting as a single nation, but it also drove them to heights of achievement that a more conformist society might never have reached. By the 8th century BC, Greece began to reawaken. This period, known as the Archaic Age, saw the rapid population growth and the emergence of the polis, or city-state. The polis was not just a city, it was a community of citizens, a distinct political and religious entity. This is where the geography of Greece locked into place with its political destiny. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes each developed its own laws, its own calendar, its own coinage, and its own identity. To handle the growing population, the Greeks began a massive wave of colonization. They sent ships west to Italy and Sicily, known as Magna Graecia, and east to the Black Sea. They founded cities like Syracuse, Naples, and Marseille, Massalia. This was not an empire in the modern sense, but a spreading of distinct, independent spores of Hellenic culture. A colony might retain religious ties to its mother city, but it was politically free. This expansion brought the Greeks into contact with the Phoenicians, from whom they borrowed the alphabet. But the Greeks did something crucial. They added vowels. The Phoenician script was a consonantal system, excellent for Semitic languages, but tricky for Greek. By adding signs for vowels, the Greeks created the first true alphabet, a technology of literacy that was easier to learn than the complex cuneiform or hieroglyphics of the older empires. This lowered the barrier to entry for literacy, planting the seeds for a more informed and engaged citizenry. In this vibrant, chaotic, archaic world, two city-states rose to prominence, representing two diametrically opposite solutions to the problems of governance and society: Sparta and Athens. Sparta, located in the fertile Eurotas Valley of the Peloponnese, became a militaristic totalitarian state. After conquering their neighbors, the Messenians, and reducing them to a status of state-owned serfs called helots, the Spartans found themselves outnumbered by their own subjects. To prevent revolt, they turned their entire society into an armed camp. The Spartan system, attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, removed boys from their families at age 7 to be raised in the agogoge, a brutal training program designed to strip away individuality and forge the perfect soldier. Spartans famously used no money, despised rhetoric, and discouraged trade. They produced no great art or philosophy, but they produced the finest heavy infantry in the world. Their stability was bought at the price of stagnation and the suppression of the self. Athens, to the northeast in Attica, took a different path. It was a trading state, open to the sea. But by the 6th century BC, it was tearing itself apart. The gap between the rich aristocracy and the poor farmers was widening. Debt slavery was rampant. Men were selling themselves and their families into servitude to pay off debts to wealthy landowners. Athens was on the brink of civil war. In 594 BC, the Athenians did something extraordinary. They appointed a man named Solon as a mediator with full power to rewrite the laws. Solon was a poet and a pragmatist. He canceled the debts, outlawed debt slavery, and restructured the class system based on agricultural production rather than birth. He didn't create democracy, but he established the principle that the law should be written down and applied to all, and he opened up the political process to a wider group of citizens. The path to democracy was not a straight line. After Solon, Athens fell under the rule of Pisistratus, a tyrant. In the Greek sense, a tyrant was not necessarily a cruel ruler, but simply one who seized power by unconstitutional means. Pisistratus was actually a builder and a champion of the poor, turning Athens into a cultural center. But his sons were less capable, and eventually, the tyranny was overthrown. In the power vacuum that followed, a distinctively Greek solution emerged. In 508 BC, an aristocrat named Cleisthenes proposed a radical reform. He broke the old tribal power bases and reorganized the citizens into 10 new tribes based on geography, mixing men from the hills, the coast, and the plains. He established the Council of 500 and the Assembly, where every male citizen had a vote. It was the birth of democratia, people power. It is crucial to remember that this democracy was limited by modern standards. Women, foreigners, and slaves were excluded. But for the roughly 30,000 to 40,000 male citizens of Athens, it was a radical experiment in direct self-rule. There were no presidents or prime ministers. The citizens met on a hill called the Nix and voted directly on laws, treaties, and wars. Just as this experiment was taking root, the Greek world faced an existential threat from the east. The Persian Empire, the largest and most powerful superpower the world had ever seen, was expanding westward. Ruled by the King of Kings, the Persian Empire stretched from India to Turkey. It was a highly efficient administrative state, tolerant of local religions but demanding absolute submission and tribute. When the Greek cities on the coast of Asia Minor, modern Turkey, rebelled against Persian rule in the Ionian Revolt, Athens sent 20 ships to help them. The revolt was crushed, but the Persian king Darius vowed to punish Athens for its interference. He ordered a servant to whisper to him every night at dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians." In 490 BC, Darius sent a punitive expedition across the Aegean. The Persians landed at the Bay of Marathon, about 26 miles from Athens. The Athenians, outnumbered and with only a small contingent of allies from Plataea, faced a terrifying choice: hide behind their walls and wait for a siege, or march out to meet the superpower on the open field. They chose to march. Under the generalship of Miltiades, the Athenian hoplites, heavily armored citizen soldiers fighting in a dense formation called a phalanx, charged the Persian lines. To the shock of the world, the amateur soldiers of the democracy broke the professional army of the empire. The Persians retreated to their ships. The runner Phidippides was said to have run the distance back to Athens to announce the victory with the word Nike before collapsing, a legend that birthed the marathon race. But the victory at Marathon did more than save a city. It validated the new system. The Athenians believed that free men fighting for their own homes were superior to subjects fighting for a king. The Persians were not done, however. 10 years later, in 480 BC, Darius's son Xerxes launched a massive invasion, this time by land and sea, with an army that drank rivers dry. Greece faced annihilation. In a rare moment of unity, 31 Greek states formed a coalition, with Sparta holding command on land and Athens at sea. The story of the 300 Spartans holding the pass at Thermopylae is legendary. King Leonidas and his royal guard, along with other Greek allies, held the narrow pass for 3 days against the Persian horde, buying time for the rest of Greece to organize. While they eventually fell, the moral victory was immense. Meanwhile, the Athenian leader Themistocles had convinced his countrymen to use the silver from a newly discovered mine to build a massive fleet of triremes, fast, maneuverable warships powered by 170 rowers. He interpreted a prophecy from the oracle at Delphi that Athens would be saved by a wooden wall, not as a physical barricade, but as the wooden hulls of ships. The decisive moment came at the Straits of Salamis. Themistocles lured the massive Persian fleet into the narrow waters, where their numbers counted for nothing. The heavier, clumsier Persian ships were smashed by the agile Greek triremes. Xerxes watched from a throne set up on a hillside as his navy was destroyed. Without control of the sea, he could not supply his massive army. He returned to Persia, leaving a smaller force behind, which was subsequently destroyed by the Spartans and Athenians at the Battle of Plataea the following year. The impossible had happened. The tiny, quarrelsome city-states of Greece had defeated the greatest empire on earth. This victory launched the Golden Age of Athens. For the next 50 years, known as the Pentacontatia, Athens dazzled the world. Under the leadership of Pericles, an aristocrat who became the champion of the common people, the democracy deepened. Jury pay was introduced, allowing even the poor to serve in the courts. The Delian League, originally a mutual defense pact against Persia, was gradually transformed into an Athenian empire. Athens forced other city-states to pay tribute, and Pericles used this money to rebuild the temples destroyed by the Persians on the Acropolis. The Parthenon, a temple to Athena the Virgin, rose as a monument to Athenian glory, a perfect fusion of mathematics and aesthetics. Its columns were slightly curved to correct for optical illusions, making them appear perfectly straight to the human eye. But the Golden Age was not just about stone, it was about the mind. This was the era of the great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Greek theater was not mere entertainment. It was a civic and religious institution. During the festival of Dionysus, thousands of citizens sat in the open-air theater to watch plays that explored the deepest questions of human existence. They watched Oedipus struggle against fate, Antigone fight for divine law against state power, and Medea take horrific revenge. These plays questioned authority, morality, and the nature of the gods, forcing the citizens to grapple with complex ethical dilemmas. Comedy also flourished, with Aristophanes mocking the politicians and philosophers of the day with body, biting satire that would rival any modern political cartoon. Parallel to the arts, a quiet revolution was taking place in philosophy. Before this time, natural phenomena were explained by the whims of the gods. Lightning was Zeus, the waves were Poseidon. But in the Ionian cities, and then in Athens, men began to look for natural causes. The pre-Socratics asked what the world was made of. Thales thought it was water. Heraclitus thought it was fire and change. Democritus proposed the staggering idea that all matter was made of tiny, uncuttable particles called atoms moving in a void. Then came Socrates, a stonecutter by trade, famously ugly and perpetually poor, Socrates wandered the marketplace of Athens asking annoying questions. He shifted the focus from the physical world to the moral world. He didn't ask what the sun was. He asked, what is justice? What is piety? What is virtue? He claimed to know nothing, but by questioning the assumptions of his fellow citizens, he revealed that they knew nothing either. The Socratic method, the process of arriving at truth through dialogue and questioning, became the bedrock of Western logic and pedagogy. While Athens philosophized, tensions with Sparta reached a breaking point. The growth of Athenian power alarmed the Spartans, leading to the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that the historian Thucydides described as the greatest disturbance in the history of the Hellenes. Breaking out in 431 BC, it was a long, grinding struggle between the elephant and the whale, Sparta's land army against Athens' naval empire. Thucydides, an Athenian general who was exiled and turned historian, chronicled the war not as a clash of heroes, but as a ruthless analysis of power, fear, and interest. He stripped away the gods and looked at the raw mechanics of human nature. The war was a catastrophe for Athens. A plague, possibly typhoid or smallpox, struck the overcrowded city behind its long walls, killing perhaps a third of the population, including Pericles. Without his steady hand, Athens fell under the sway of demagogues, leaders who appealed to the emotions and prejudices of the mob. The most notorious was Alcibiades, a brilliant, handsome, but utterly unprincipled aristocrat who was a student of Socrates. The war grew brutal. In the Melian dialogue, Thucydides records the Athenian ultimatum to the small island of Melos. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. The Athenians slaughtered the men of Melos and enslaved the women and children, a moral low point for the city of wisdom. The war ended in 404 BC with the total defeat of Athens. The Spartan fleet, paid for by Persian gold, destroyed the Athenian navy. Athens was besieged and starved into surrender. Its walls were torn down to the sound of flute music. The golden age was over. Socrates became a scapegoat for the city's failures. Accused of corrupting the youth and introducing new gods, he was put on trial. In a final act of defiance, he refused to beg for mercy and was sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. The democracy had killed its greatest son. Yet, the intellectual fire of Greece did not go out. It merely changed form. Socrates' student, Plato, was so horrified by the execution of his master that he turned his back on politics and founded the Academy, the world's first institution of higher learning. Plato wrote dialogues featuring Socrates, preserving his methods, but went on to develop his own philosophy of ideal forms, arguing that the world we see is just a shadow of a higher, perfect reality. Plato's student Aristotle took a different path. The son of a doctor, Aristotle was a biologist at heart. He founded the Lyceum and set about categorizing all human knowledge. He wrote on physics, metaphysics, poetry, theater, music, logic, rhetoric, linguistics, politics, government, ethics, biology, and zoology. For Aristotle, truth was found in the observation of the physical world. If Plato pointed up to the heavens, Aristotle pointed down to the earth. Between the two of them, they mapped out the territory of Western thought. While the city-states exhausted themselves in endless wars, a new power was rising in the north. Macedon was a rough kingdom, considered semi-barbaric by the southern Greeks. But its king, Philip II, was a genius of military organization. He reformed the Macedonian army, equipping his soldiers with the sarissa, an 18-foot-long pike. The Macedonian phalanx was a porcupine of spear points that could roll over any traditional hoplite formation. Combined with heavy cavalry, it was unstoppable. Philip conquered the Greek city-states one by one, through diplomacy, bribery, and force. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, the independence of the Greek polis effectively ended. Philip forced them into a league under his command, with the stated goal of invading Persia. But Philip was assassinated before he could launch his great campaign. The task fell to his 20-year-old son, Alexander. Tutored by Aristotle, Alexander believed himself to be a new Achilles. He was a terrifying mix of intellectual curiosity, romantic ambition, and ruthless military efficiency. In 334 BC, he crossed into Asia with about 40,000 men. What followed was a decade of conquest that shattered the geopolitical map of the ancient world. Alexander swept through Turkey, down the coast of the Levant, and into Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator and crowned pharaoh. He founded the city of Alexandria on the Nile Delta, which would become the new intellectual capital of the world. He then turned east, marching into the heart of the Persian Empire. At the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, Alexander's tactical brilliance dismantled the massive army of King Darius III. The Persian Empire, which had loomed over Greece for nearly 2 centuries, had fallen. But Alexander didn't stop. He pushed on into Afghanistan and Central Asia, fighting guerrilla wars in the mountains, and eventually crossed the Indus River into India. His men, exhausted and far from home, finally refused to go further. Alexander turned back, only to die of a fever in Babylon at the age of 32. He had created one of the largest empires in history, but he left no clear heir. When asked on his deathbed to whom he left his empire, he reportedly whispered, "To the strongest." The empire fractured into warring kingdoms ruled by his generals, beginning the Hellenistic Age. This was a new kind of Greek world. The small, insular city-state was replaced by vast cosmopolitan kingdoms. The Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, the Antigonids in Macedon. Greek culture, language, and architecture spread all the way to the Himalayas. A gymnasia was built in Afghanistan. Greek plays were performed in India. This was an era of syncretism, a blending of Greek and Eastern cultures. The statue of the Buddha began to appear, influenced by Greek sculptural styles, wearing the toga-like himation. In the great city of Alexandria in Egypt, the Ptolemies built the famous library and the museum, literally the Temple of the Muses. It was a state-funded research institute where the greatest minds of the day gathered. Euclid codified geometry in his Elements, a textbook used until the 20th century. Archimedes of Syracuse, perhaps the greatest engineer of antiquity, formulated the laws of buoyancy and levers, famously saying, "Give me a place to stand and I will move the earth." Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth by measuring the shadows of obelisks in different cities, arriving at a figure that was accurate to within a few percent. Hero of Alexandria even invented a primitive steam engine, though it was treated as a toy rather than a machine for industry. The medical researchers Herophilus and Erasistratus practiced human dissection, discovering the nervous system and the function of the heart valves, moving medicine far beyond the humors of Hippocrates. This Hellenistic world was modern in many ways. It was a world of big cities, professional armies, and international trade. But it was also a world of alienation. The citizen was no longer a decision-maker in a close-knit community, but a subject in a vast, impersonal empire. Philosophy shifted to match this new reality. Stoicism, founded by Zeno, taught that since one cannot control the external world, one must master one's internal reaction to it, cultivating self-control and fortitude. Epicureanism taught that the goal of life was modest pleasure and the avoidance of pain and anxiety, achieved by withdrawing from the turmoil of politics. These were philosophies for people navigating a large, unpredictable world, offering therapeutic comfort rather than political agency. However, to the West, a new power was rising that would eventually swallow the Greek world whole. Rome had been watching the squabbles of the Hellenistic kings with growing interest. The Romans admired Greek culture. They copied their art, adopted their gods, and learned their philosophy. But they had a martial discipline and a political cohesion that the fractured Greek states lacked. One by one, the Greek kingdoms fell to the Roman legions. In 146 BC, the Roman general Mummius sacked the ancient city of Corinth, razing it to the ground as a lesson to the Greeks. The independence of Greece was extinguished. But as the Roman poet Horace famously wrote, "Captive Greece took captive her rude conqueror." The Romans were culturally seduced by the people they had defeated. Wealthy Romans employed Greek tutors for their sons, collected Greek statues, and studied Greek rhetoric. The eastern half of the Roman Empire remained Greek-speaking. The New Testament was written in Greek, ensuring that the concepts of Christianity would be filtered through the lens of Greek philosophy. The concept of the logos, the word, was a Greek idea before it was a Christian one. The legacy of ancient Greece is not merely a collection of ruins or a list of dates. It is a way of thinking. It is the invention of the critical spirit. Before the Greeks, wisdom was largely handed down by priests and kings as immutable truth. The Greeks dared to suggest that truth was something to be discovered, debated, and proven. They invented the distinction between nature, physis, and custom, nomos, realizing that while the laws of gravity are universal, the laws of society are man-made and can be changed. This distinction is the root of all social reform and political revolution. They gave us the vocabulary of our politics: democracy, tyranny, aristocracy, oligarchy, politics itself. They gave us the categories of our literature: tragedy, comedy, history, epic, lyric. They gave us the framework of our science and mathematics. Even their failures are instructive. The Greeks were capable of profound blindness. They invented democracy, but kept slavery. They spoke of freedom, but excluded women from public life. They produced great art, but constantly fought petty, suicidal wars that destroyed their own civilization. They were not perfect sages. They were deeply flawed, passionate, and often irrational human beings. But in their struggle to understand the world and themselves, they lit a fire that has never truly gone out. When we engage in a debate, when we vote in an election, when we watch a play, when we diagnose a disease, or when we simply ask why, we are participating in a conversation that began in the agoras and gymnasiums of ancient Greece. The civilization that invented the future did not vanish. It was metabolized into the bloodstream of the world. It exists in the architecture of our minds. The ruins of the Parthenon may stand silent on the Acropolis, bleached by the sun and battered by time, but the ideas that built it are as alive today as they were in the time of Pericles. The experiment of reason, liberty, and humanism is ongoing, a baton passed from the runner at marathon to us. The Greeks showed us what human beings are capable of: the highest heights of reason and the lowest depths of brutality. They defined the parameters of the human condition. And as long as humans continue to think, question, and create, the Greeks will never truly be dead. Their story is the first chapter of our own biography, a testament to the enduring power of the inquiring mind to shape reality. While the sweeping narrative of wars and philosophies provides the skeletal structure of ancient Greek history, The true genius of this civilization lies hidden in the intricate connective tissue of their daily innovations, the specific mechanics they devised to solve the physical and social problems of their world. To understand how deep the Greek invention of the future truly ran, we must zoom in from the bird's-eye view of empires and eras to the microscopic level of gears, surgical tools, lottery machines, and ship hulls. It is in these details that we find a society not just dreaming of a better world, but actively engineering one, using a blend of intuition, observation, and raw technological audacity that would not be rivaled for another 2 millennia. One of the most vivid examples of this practical genius is found in the way the Athenians engineered the very democracy that defined them. We often think of democracy as a philosophy, an abstract ideal of equality, but for the Athenians it was a physical system that required complex machinery to function without corruption. They understood intuitively that the greatest threat to a fair society was the human tendency toward bribery, nepotism, and factionalism. To combat this, they did not rely on honor codes alone. They built machines to enforce fairness. The centerpiece of this technological democracy was the Clariterion. Standing in the agora, these great stone slabs looked somewhat like primitive vending machines, incised with rows of small slots. When a jury was needed for the courts, and Athenian juries could consist of 500, 1,000, or even 1,500 citizens to make bribery impossible, the potential jurors would insert their ticket, a bronze or wooden plaque called a pinakion, into the slots. A tube attached to the side of the machine was then filled with a mixture of black and white bronze dice. A crank was turned, releasing one die at a time. If a white die emerged, the citizens whose tickets were in that row were selected for jury duty for the day. If a black die emerged, they were dismissed. This device, simple in its mechanical operation, but profound in its implication, randomized the administration of justice. It was a cryptographic solution to a sociological problem. By removing human agency from the selection process, the Athenians ensured that no powerful aristocrat could stack a jury with his supporters. The Clariterion was the physical embodiment of the radical idea that all citizens were interchangeable, and that the specific wisdom of the individual mattered less than the collective, uncorrupted judgment of the many. This obsession with engineering extended from the courtroom to the battlefield, nowhere more visibly than in the supreme weapon of the era, the trireme. The victory at Salamis was not just a triumph of courage, it was a triumph of naval architecture. The trireme was not merely a boat, it was a guided missile, designed for a single purpose, to ram and sink enemy vessels. Its design pushed the limits of physics and materials science known at the time. The challenge was to pack maximum kinetic energy into a vessel that had to be light enough to be fast, but strong enough to withstand the shock of impact. The solution was a masterpiece of compromise. The ship was long and slender, about 120 feet in length, but only 12 feet wide, a ratio that made it incredibly fast but dangerously unstable. To power it, the Greeks stacked rowers in 3 tiers, the Thalamites at the bottom, the Zygites in the middle, and the Thranites at the top, packing 170 men into a confined, sweating, terrifyingly claustrophobic space. The engineering genius lay in the hypozomata, a heavy rope that ran from stem to stern, tensioned like a bowstring. This tendon kept the long, sleek hull from snapping in half under the stress of the waves and the ramming impact. It was an early application of pretensioning in structural engineering. When a trireme accelerated to ramming speed, reaching perhaps 10 knots, the kinetic energy focused on the bronze-encased ram at the prow was devastating. But the human engineering was just as impressive as the naval architecture. A trireme crew was not a collection of galley slaves lashed to the oars. They were free citizens, highly trained professionals who had to row in perfect unison. A single rower missing a beat could tangle the oars and leave the ship dead in the water. The synchronization required a neurological unity among 170 men that was induced by the rhythmic piping of a flutist, the auletes. This was a machine made of wood and flesh, integrated so seamlessly that the boundary between the tool and the user vanished. While the Athenians were perfecting the machinery of war and politics, a different kind of revolution was taking place in the quiet corners of the Greek world, one that would redefine the human relationship with the biological body. This was the birth of rational medicine. Before the 5th century BC, sickness was largely viewed as a spiritual affliction, a pollution sent by angry gods or malevolent spirits. If a man fell into a seizure, it was the sacred disease, a touch of the divine or demonic. The treatment was prayer, sacrifice, or a visit to the temples of Asclepius to sleep in the Abaton, hoping for a healing dream. But on the island of Kos, a physician named Hippocrates began to teach a radically different approach. The Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of writings attributed to him and his students, laid the foundation for clinical observation. They argued that every disease has a natural cause, and if the cause is natural, it can be understood and treated. This was a staggering cognitive leap. They began to view the body not as a vessel for spirits, but as a system of fluids and balances. They developed the theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. While this theory was biologically incorrect, the method used to arrive at it was sound scientific practice, observation, categorization, and prognosis. Hippocratic doctors became meticulous recorders of data. They noted the complexion of the patient, the temperature of the skin, the smell of the breath, the sediment in the urine. They realized that environment played a huge role in health. In the treatise On Airs, Waters, and Places, they analyzed how wind direction, water quality, and seasonal changes affected the health of populations, effectively inventing the field of epidemiology. They were the first to disconnect the physical suffering of the human body from the moral judgment of the universe. A fever was no longer a punishment for sin. It was a sign that the body was fighting to cook out an imbalance. This shift destigmatized illness and turned the physician from a priest into a mechanic of the human frame. The Greek investigation into the mechanics of the world did not stop at the human body. It reached out to the heavens themselves. For centuries, scholars believed that while the Greeks were great thinkers, they were indifferent engineers who disdained manual labor and technology. This view was shattered in 1901 with the discovery of the Antikythera mechanism. Recovered from a shipwreck off the coast of the island of Antikythera, this corroded lump of bronze, initially mistaken for a rock, turned out to be the most sophisticated piece of machinery from antiquity, a device so complex that nothing comparable would be built for another 1,000 years. It was, effectively, an analog computer. Dating to the 2nd or 1st century BC, the mechanism contained a system of at least 30 meshing bronze gears housed in a wooden case the size of a shoebox. By turning a hand crank, a user could calculate the positions of the sun, the moon, and the planets on any given date in the past or future. It could predict solar and lunar eclipses with precision, even accounting for the color of the eclipse, which was used for astrological divination. But the engineering inside was even more mind-boggling than its function. The Greeks had incorporated a pin-and-slot mechanism to account for the variable speed of the moon, the fact that the moon moves faster when it is closer to the Earth and slower when it is further away. This is a direct mechanical representation of the anomaly in the moon's orbit, a problem that Kepler would not describe mathematically until the 17th century. The maker of this machine had managed to model the irregularities of the cosmos using differential gearing, a technology that we previously thought was not invented until the Industrial Revolution. The existence of the Antikythera mechanism forces us to rewrite the history of technology. It suggests that the Greeks possessed a high technology tradition that was almost entirely lost, a steampunk reality of brass and gears that operated alongside the marble statues and philosophical dialogues. It hints that the scientific revolution might have begun 2,000 years earlier than we think, only to be crushed by the collapse of the Roman economy and the loss of the manufacturing base required to sustain such precision engineering. This fascination with mechanical simulation extended to the playful and the theatrical in the Hellenistic period, particularly in the city of Alexandria. Here, the engineer hero of Alexandria created devices that blurred the line between magic and mechanics. He built the first steam engine, the eolipile, a sphere that spun rapidly when heated by a boiler. While the Greeks never connected this engine to a piston to do work, perhaps because labor was cheap in a slave economy, removing the economic incentive for industrialization, it demonstrated a grasp of the principles of thermodynamics. Hero used his engineering skills to create miracles in temples. He designed automatic doors that would open when a fire was lit on an altar. The heat expanded the air in a chamber beneath the floor, pushing water into a bucket that acted as a counterweight to pull the doors open. To the worshiper, it looked like the god was welcoming them. To Hero, it was a manipulation of pneumatics and hydraulics. He even invented the world's first vending machine, a device where a dropped coin would tilt a lever to dispense a measure of holy water. These inventions, often dismissed as toys, show a society that had completely demystified the physical forces of the world and was beginning to bend them to its will. They were experimenting with feedback loops, automation, and programmable movements. Hero also designed a programmable cart powered by a falling weight that could navigate a specific path using wound ropes, a precursor to the punch cards of the Jacquard loom and early computing. Yet, for all this focus on the rational and the mechanical, the Greek mind remained deeply entangled with the mystical. The same civilization that invented the gear train also maintained the Eleusinian Mysteries, a secret religious festival held annually near Athens that persisted for nearly 2,000 years. This was not the open, civic religion of animal sacrifice and public feasting. This was a personal, terrified encounter with the divine. The mysteries were centered on the myth of Demeter and her daughter Persephone, who was abducted by Hades into the underworld. Initiates, who included slaves, women, and emperors, were sworn to absolute secrecy on pain of death. We still do not know exactly what happened inside the Telesterion, the great hall of initiation, but we know it involved a journey from darkness to light and the consumption of a sacred drink called the kykeon. Some modern ethnobotanists and chemists speculate that the kykeon, made from barley, water, and mint, may have been contaminated, intentionally or not, with the ergot fungus, which contains psychoactive alkaloids similar to LSD. If this controversial theory holds, it would mean that the spiritual heart of Greek civilization, the experience that Plato and Cicero praised as taking away the fear of death, was a chemically induced psychedelic state, a structured hallucination that revealed the continuity of life and death. This duality, the hyper-rational astronomer plotting the stars with gears and the mystic drinking a hallucinogen in a dark hall, is the essence of the Greek experience. They did not see science and religion as enemies. They saw them as two different methods of piercing the veil of appearances to reach the hidden reality underneath. The Greek mastery of the physical world also manifested in their massive architectural projects, which went far beyond the aesthetic perfection of the Parthenon. They were masters of water management. The tunnel of Eupalinos on the island of Samos is a testament to their geometric confidence. In the 6th century BC, the tyrant Polycrates ordered a tunnel to be dug through Mount Castro to bring water to his capital. Two teams of diggers started from opposite sides of the mountain. Without lasers, GPS, or modern surveying equipment, relying only on geometry and line-of-sight calculations, they dug for over a kilometer through solid limestone. When the two teams met in the middle, their tunnels were offset by only a few feet. It was a high-stakes gamble on the validity of mathematical theory. If the math had been wrong, the teams would have missed each other, and the project would have been a colossal failure. The success of the tunnel proved that the abstract rules of geometry invented by Thales and Pythagoras were not just mental games. They were descriptions of the physical structure of reality. This realization empowered the Greeks to reshape their landscape. They drained swamps, diverted rivers, and built harbors. The Mole at Syracuse and the Diolkos at Corinth, a paved trackway that allowed ships to be hauled overland across the isthmus, effectively a railway for boats, demonstrated an approach to infrastructure that was driven by economic pragmatism and engineering bravado. As we probe deeper into the specific contributions of the Greeks, we must also look at their invention of history itself. Before Herodotus, the past was a list of king lists or a collection of myths. There was no analysis, no attempt to cross-reference sources, no skepticism. Herodotus, often called the father of history, and sometimes the father of lies, changed this. He traveled extensively, interviewing witnesses, collecting stories, and noting customs. But he did something crucial. He admitted uncertainty. He would often say, "This is what the Persians say, but the Egyptians tell it differently." He introduced the concept of multiple perspectives. His successor, Thucydides, sharpened this into a scientific instrument. Writing about the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides explicitly rejected the intervention of the gods as an explanation for events. He did not say Athens lost because Athena was angry. He said Athens lost because of bad strategy, overextension, and the sociopathic ambition of Alcibiades. He analyzed the plague of Athens not as a divine curse, but as a biological event, describing the symptoms with clinical detachment so that, as he wrote, it might be recognized if it ever breaks out again. Thucydides invented political science. He analyzed the behavior of states as if they were biological organisms driven by fear, honor, and interest. His analysis of the Corcyraean Civil War, where he describes how words changed their meanings to fit the violence of the moment, recklessness became courage, prudence became cowardice, is a chillingly accurate diagnosis of political polarization that remains relevant to every modern democracy. In the realm of matter theory, the Greeks made leaps of intuition that are frankly unsettling. The atomists, Leucippus and Democritus, sitting on the rocks of Abdera, theorized that if you cut a piece of cheese in half, and then in half again, and kept going, eventually you would reach a particle that could not be cut, the atomos. They argued that these atoms were infinite in number, eternal, and moved through a void. They proposed that the properties of materials, why water flows and iron is hard, depended on the shape and interlocking arrangement of these atoms. Sweet things were made of round, smooth atoms. Bitter things were made of jagged atoms that tore the tongue. While their specific chemistry was wrong, their fundamental insight that the visible world is an emergent property of invisible interactions between discrete particles is the basis of all modern physics. They arrived at this not through microscopes or colliders, but through sheer force of logical necessity. They realized that for change to occur without something coming from nothing, there must be an underlying, unchanging substrate. This atomic theory was so dangerous, so atheistic in its implication that the soul itself was just a swarm of atoms that dissolved at death, that it was largely suppressed by the idealism of Plato and later by the Church, only to be rediscovered in the Renaissance to jumpstart modern science. The Greeks also invented the concept of the museum and the library, institutions that we take for granted as repositories of culture, but which were radical innovations in information technology. The Great Library of Alexandria was not just a collection of scrolls. It was an attempt to download the entire hard drive of human knowledge into one location. The Ptolemaic kings were aggressive in their acquisition of knowledge. They decreed that any ship docking in Alexandria had to surrender its books to be copied. The library kept the originals and gave the copies back to the ship. They sent agents to Athens to borrow the official state copies of the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, putting down a massive fortune as a deposit, and then happily forfeited the deposit to keep the originals. This hunger for data created the first critical scholarship. Librarians like Xenodotus and Aristarchus began to compare different manuscripts of Homer, noting errors, interpolations, and variations. They invented the footnote, the glossary, and the critical edition. They were the first to treat a text not as a sacred object, but as a data set to be cleaned, organized, and analyzed. This systematization of knowledge allowed for the cross-pollination of ideas. A mathematician could talk to an astronomer, who could talk to a geographer. It was in this environment that Eratosthenes, the chief librarian, managed to calculate the circumference of the Earth. He heard that on the summer solstice in the city of Syene, modern Aswan, the sun shone directly to the bottom of a well, casting no shadow. He knew that on the same day in Alexandria, a vertical stick cast a shadow. By measuring the angle of that shadow and knowing the distance between the two cities, which he paid professional pacers, or bematists, to walk and measure, he used simple geometry to calculate the size of the planet. He was within a few hundred kilometers of the true value. This was not just a mathematical trick. It was a fundamental shift in scale. The Greeks had intellectually encompassed the entire planet. They knew it was a globe, they knew how big it was, and they began to map it with latitude and longitude, a grid system invented by Hipparchus. It is also worth noting the Greek contribution to the concept of leisure and the good life. The word school comes from the Greek skol, which paradoxically means leisure. For the Greeks, leisure was not sitting on a couch doing nothing. It was the time freedom to pursue self-improvement, learning, and civic engagement. They believed that work, labor for the sake of survival, was a necessity that should be minimized to allow for the true work of being human, thinking, exercising, and debating. This worldview was, of course, supported by the brutal institution of slavery, which freed the citizen class from drudgery. This is the dark energy that powered the Greek Enlightenment. The machines, the geometry, and the philosophy were often produced by men who owned other human beings. However, the ideal they articulated, that the goal of society is to create the conditions for human flourishing, eudaimonia, remains the central project of modern civilization. They were the first to suggest that a society should be judged not by the wealth of its king or the size of its army, but by the quality of the men and women it produces. Even in their decline, the Greeks continued to innovate. The Hellenistic period saw the rise of the novel as a literary form. Stories like Daphnis and Chloe or the Ethiopica moved away from the great myths and focused on ordinary people, romance, pirates, and adventure. These were the ancestors of the modern paperback, entertainment for a literate urban class. They explored individual psychology and private emotion in a way that the stark, public archetypes of tragedy never did. This shift signaled a move towards individualism that mirrors our own modern sensibilities. The protagonist was no longer a king or a demigod, but a boy or a girl in love, navigating a chaotic world. The military technology also evolved into terrifying new forms. The engineer Dionysius of Alexandria invented the polybolos, a repeating ballista. It was a chain-driven machine gun for arrows. By turning a windlass, the operator could automatically load, cock, and fire arrows in rapid succession. This kind of mechanization of death showed that the Greeks were applying their analytical skills to every aspect of existence, from the highest abstract theology to the most brutal efficiency of slaughter. The siege of Rhodes in 305 BC saw the deployment of the Helepolis, the city taker, a massive armored siege tower 40 meters tall, plated with iron to resist fire, and packed with catapults. It was a land battleship. The countermeasures were equally inventive. The Rhodians flooded the ground in front of the tower to mire it in mud. This arms race of intellect demonstrates that the Greek miracle was not a static moment of perfection, but a dynamic, often violent process of constant adaptation and problem-solving. As we look at the specific gears of the Antikythera mechanism, the medical notes of Hippocrates, the ballots of the Clariterion, and the geometry of the Eupalinos tunnel, we see a civilization that was engaged in a wrestle with reality. They were not content to accept the world as it was. They wanted to take it apart, see how it worked, and put it back together in a better configuration. They were the first hackers. They hacked the code of politics to create democracy. They hacked the code of music to discover the mathematical ratios of harmony. They hacked the code of the human body to invent medicine. Their legacy is not just in the big ideas of freedom and logic, but in the methodology of the fix, the belief that, with enough thought, enough observation, and enough clever engineering, any problem, whether it is calculating the date of an eclipse or selecting a fair jury, can be solved. This confidence in the power of the human mind to engineer a solution is the most specific and enduring gift they gave to the future. It is the operating system of the modern world.